The Center for Educational Media and the College of Education at Middle Tennessee State University are proud to offer professional development to K-12 educators in Tennessee through our online video library. These videos are aligned with standards set by the Tennessee Department of Education. For more professional development videos, check out our website at www.mtsu.edu/CEM.
So now we're going to transition to the second session of today. We would like to welcome Professor William Beck, who is a former school counselor from Bedford County and is now a full-time temp faculty member at in our counseling Tennessee State University, and is also pursuing his doctorate degree at Referral. So welcome, William. The title of his is Trauma-Informed School Counseling. So we will turn it over to him. Welcome, Professor Beck.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Wilson. Thank you, Frank. And so we're going to get going with the presentation today. So I'm going to be talking about trauma-informed counseling. And I've been a school counselor for the past 5 years in an elementary setting. It's all to make that transition from being in the field to being a counselor educator. And Wilson convinced me to come over to the other side, told me how big of a difference that can make as far as working both in the and training other future school counselors up. So for this opportunity to kind of widen my reach as far as difference that we're making in students' lives, which obviously that is what it is all about, and making sure that student services, that school is a safe place, and foremost. So we're going to be talking about trauma-informed counseling, really putting counseling back in school counseling. And I've always thought it's a bit odd with counseling being in our profession, and yet for some, definitely not all, but for some, it can be the activity that people do least. There are a wide variety of reasons for that being the case. One is sometimes just a comfortability with what's appropriate school setting as far as counseling goes. Knowing that going back into a classroom with 20, 25 other students is what interventions are appropriate to utilize in a school setting. Having maybe 3 to 6 sessions that you might feel limited to schedule. And then you go into reasons such as time restraints, and that has a lot to do with understanding of what the role of a school counselor is within the school setting. Once again, at every school, even every district, is quite different in administrators' perception of what is school. Appropriate roles, inappropriate roles. As I do want to address as far as when you're in the school, still utilizing the time that you have built into your schedule, very effective in trauma-informed counseling. Today, we're going to cover 3 areas. One being going back and looking at, generally speaking, that framework of support. I'm actually going to come in and complement that very well in the next session. But I always like to tie in RTS squared B or MTSS into this mix, knowing where it fits in your program. The next component is simply just counseling in the schools. What's appropriate, what's not so much, and then going into the techniques. Obviously, this is just a 1-hour presentation to train you in any modality or anything like that, but 2 just techniques, which may have been previously thought to be most appropriate in a school setting, but can very much to be appropriate and helpful for students. And so I first want to talk about being as a school counselor. I can remember sessions of school counseling, and one of the first Lee Bagwell, he who used to lead in the state school counseling, and she shared of this kind of the story of the school counselor coming to school and always being very reactive in nature. There was a little bit of an agenda of what to do today, but this counselor often was maybe in an office, or if he needed help, the school counselor responded. And so it turned into a day filled with kind of putting out fires, crisis management. If someone had the unfortunate perspective that you were sitting in your office not doing anything, jumping in and helping, and how for many school counselors that leads into burnout. Even though a lot is good that's happening, especially with helping with those crisis responses, it's easy whenever there's organization to that to feel like you're not making much of a difference today. And when you operate in that manner, there's often a lack of data for is what I'm doing actually making a difference in the school. And so it can lead to quite a bit of discouragement, even though you know yourself, you are with students one-on-one continually and getting them to feel safe. So the video then transitioned how to get out of that kind of that crisis management, putting yours continually, and into one where you feel like you are in charge of your school and you know whether you're making a difference or not. That has to do with, as we've learned, that comprehensive school program based on the ASCA national model. So it refers to, going through that model, develop a schedule, which of course will, have been waiting to follow it, but it does provide you with some structure. It helps you to feel in charge of when you are implementing school lessons, when you're implementing small group counseling, and when you're doing those individual counseling amongst all the vast array of indirect services and things like that. I can remember sitting in class and remembering how easy it would be to into that trap of just responding continually to a child at a teacher's desk, or crying or not wanting to do their work. And I just remember feeling that would very much lead me to burning out very quickly. And so in the beginning, I tried to think, how can I put all of this into a framework to make sure it's sustainable for myself and to really know for sure I'm actually working and making a difference. So from day one, and I think could have done that alone, the school that I was a part of was very data driven in nature. And part of that was because we knew, based on the demographics that we had, the students that we had, that we needed to make sure that support was very equitable and far reaching in its approach. And so leading into that, not only do we have the ASCA national model, which is a comprehensive model, but we also have Tennessee's support over the years, where they've developed the MTS model, multi-tiered systems of support. And so you've seen this over the years. You've probably seen it initiated as academic RTI, 3 tiers of support, and then we saw come along behavioral RTI. And then several years ago, this came out from the state. It's basically a mental health RTI. And so the grant got renewed from the state, which was formerly referred to TBSP. Some people called it Tablespoon, Tennessee Behavior Supports Project. And it was a grant from the state of Tennessee to really develop and implement behavioral RTI within the schools. Just last year, that grant got renewed. As very typical with grants, it was renamed. And so now hearing the MTSS Center, and if you're in the Tennessee area, that would be Vanderbilt, who leads the charge in our, it's UT Knoxville for East Tennessee, and then Memphis, Lambeth in the West Tennessee area. So those are these that are helping with the implementation of things MTSS. And their initiative starting this year is, how do you integrate academics, behavior, and mental health? Because when you really get down into the nitty gritty, it's like when you observe students' behavior in the classroom, sometimes it's very important to figure out what's the root of this. Is the root more of a behavioral issue which is causing academic issues? Vice versa. Is it an academic deficit, a cognitive deficit is causing behavioral issues? And so really when you grade all three of these, you are able to targeting and being specific in what the student actually needs and come alongside their services. So in the context of RTI2B or MTSS for mental health, there are three tiers of support. And this is designed in such a way where every student in the school is receiving some kind of support, but the amount of support students need is what varies. And so you can see Tennessee inverted the triangle, and the reason for doing, unlike other states, but the reason for doing that is when you look at this triangle, your eye goes to tier 1. That's incredibly important, that no matter what you do, no matter whether you have tier 2, tier 3 in place, the emphasis always needs to be placed at tier 1. And that's because every student is receiving tier 1 support. So when you take the attention away from tier 1 to much more about the responses of tier 2 and tier 3, sometimes what happens is school-wide, you're going to notice an effect students in the school are receiving any kind of support. Back and figuring out universally how can we support the school. So at the tier 1 level, which typically for most schools, and every school differs on their data, but typically speaking, 80 to 85% of only tier 1 supports are needed, 80 to 85% population. And so what you want to do to adequately address this is have a school-wide or school district mental health policy and crisis planning. Ideally, you as a school are not just operating solo, but you know from your office or from your district office what their policy is, support, equitable services, how to respond to certain situations. Another important is establishing a process for early identification and mental health referrals. If you've been through the RD, you know that we often have a refer, and instead of referring to them as referrals, we say nominations, and yes, connotation pieces. So additionally, student communities, trauma-informed practices. I know Vanderbilt in particular is very much infusing trauma-informed practices into their behavioral RTI components as well. So if it feels sometimes like you're either doing RTI2B or trauma-informed, they're once again infusing that to make it make a lot more sense to know that they are not separate things, but they're integrated into one. Additionally, there are restorative practices. Many schools are getting this approach, which is not simply just reactive in nature, but there is proactive components to restorative justice. One of the main ones has to do with classroom circles. And this is simply where many of you probably know this, but it's where teachers get to have just a very, very brief kind of check-in in the morning and to help build that community culture so that when students walk in, the whole day is not simply spent on academics, but that social and emotional component is integrated in building community within the classroom and within the school. Additionally, there are social and personal competencies and health and wellness education. All of that can look vastly different amongst districts and schools, but ideally some component of this is implemented within your school. And we're going to talk about that today just a bit in terms of what can you do from your position. At the tier 2 level, we have mental health interventions and progress monitoring, and then effective individual and small group counseling. And I'm going to come back to that in just a bit, but you can expect that 10 to 15% of the population is going to need tier 2 supports. So if you're at a school of 500 students, then at minimum, at least about 50 are going to need that support. And then at the tier 3 level, few students, 3 to 5% of the population are going to be in need of a very intense amount of support at the tier 3 level. That would involve community-based mental health services, transition and re-entry planning, and even school-based mental health consultation, therapy, and wraparound services. And if you're familiar with Tier 3, that wraparound approach simply looks like very similar to an IEP meeting, in which it's a uniquely constructed team designed to help build the most adequate support for one student in particular. Now, let me go back to Tier 2 where it says effective individual and small group counseling, but focus simply on the individual counseling component. When I've done kind of research as far as states' interpretations of these models, where does individual counseling fit in to the tiers, there is a bit of discrepancy amongst these states and interpretations of, is individual counseling a Tier 2 support or is it a 3 support? And here's where I think the discrepancy comes in. A lot of people think if you're referring to Tier 3, you're referring to one-on-one support, and that's not necessarily the case. What Tier 3 means is that the support that you're giving a student is uniquely tailored to that student. So here's how this would play out here too with individual counseling is, for instance, if I feel trained and competent in play therapy in the school setting, and play therapy has, especially non-directed child-centered play therapy, has quite a rigid response in how you respond and facilitate that session. If I'm operating in the exact same manner with every student, I'm not tailoring that intervention for the student. I'm utilizing the same modality, same intervention for the student, which is how it fit into the Tier 2 range. Your design team needs to be created for the student. I, as a school counselor or counselor, can operate with non-directed child-centered play therapy to meet the needs of the students to make a difference. So I will say, I don't think it's necessary to get caught up too much of the details, but sometimes you're going to see individual counseling in the Tier 2 range. Sometimes you're going to see in the Tier 3 range, and I think they could fit either way, depending upon what's being done with the student. So once again, zooming out and making sure that framework is there so that we're operating in a manner in which we're just responding to a crisis continuing throughout the day. And I can remember the school that I was at, I could have spent a considerable amount of my day simply just responding to students who were dysregulated. And so I think that Julia and Ashley are going to do a great job of, when you have situations like that, which affect well beyond 10 students, and I say 10 for a reason, then really that's a Tier 1 issue. And so you would want to address that as a Tier 1 issue, because how can I address that many students getting dysregulated in a class? Maybe that would have to do with teacher training, classroom lessons as well about regulation. And so today, and for my presentation, we're just going to focus on that kind of that organized way of responding to students who need support. Now, I got this, and the citation is here at the bottom, and then if you want to look this handbook up, now is the time from 2015, and then once again, you'll see the full citation at the end. But there are 4 stages of a referral pathway assessment. So when asking yourself, okay, well, how do students adequate support in my school? Do they just come to us whenever they want? I let them in, I counsel them. Once again, not a organized way of carrying yourself throughout it, although there will be times that we know that needs to happen. But how to implement a referral system and manage that flow in order to serve as many students as possible. So the first stage is establishing a system in general. And if your school implements MTSS, RTI squared B, some schools I hear are still referring to as PBIS, a lot of different acronyms and names, they're all the same basically. If you're implementing those, then you already have a system. And so what I would suggest, if you're a school counselor having a hard time with your administration, kind of coming on board with the Ask a Nat model, I would say figure out how to get yourself, your Ask a National model into the MSS framework, because it actually fits quite beautifully. And that was my approach. Rather than coming in and saying that my school needed to fit the Ask a National model, I was like, let me see how I can fit into school's attempt at managing behavior, discipline, and so. So the second stage refers to, once you have that referral system, how can you manage it? You're going to get referrals, you're going to get nominations, you're going to see that there's a need, and how do we respond? Stage 3 is, okay, when we know there's a need, what are our options? And this is really like if you were to go to a restaurant and open up the menu, you would see all your options we can have. And in the same way, we want to build out basically a menu of options referring to interventions and support for students. If you only have one or two ways to respond to problematic behavior, you're pretty limited in the effectiveness because every child is quite different and they need different options. If you're have that lens of behavioral theory, you're going to see that not all students act a certain way just to get adult attention. Sometimes they're acting a certain way to avoid adult attention. Sometimes they're trying to escape, engage in avoidance behaviors. So when you know and operate from that behavioral lens, you want to have actions that match the function of the behavior. And then 4, you really want to be able to evaluate the effectiveness of the intervention. And I will go ahead and admit, if you're utilizing a counseling modality, that is a lot harder to do than, say, for check-in, check-out. I think we know as counselors that just because there's not that necessarily supports whether it's working or not, we know that that process, that data doesn't always come through in the same way with checkout or a social skills group. So I just want to admit that I very much recognize that. And at the same time, there are ways to implement some data approaches. You can create the scales for those. You can use mood meters and that, but it is more on the difficult side with counseling, especially when you might be limited due to your schedule and due to the amount of students who need support. When you might be limited to like 3 to 5 individuals, it is admittedly harder to notice a difference, and yet we know the student is benefiting from such services. So if we go back to stage 1, we really look at not simply just referral nominations, which we'll get to in just a bit, but what about early education? Do you have a way in your system where you can, before any issues escalate or intensify, do you have a way to go ahead and identify which students need support? And so this is at free scale, and Vanderbilt in particular, I know that the other universities as well offer it, but it's student risk screening scale, internalizing and externalizing. And you will see that this is the elementary school version, but there is a secondary version as well. And the only difference is that peer rejection counts twice for both internalizing and externalizing in the secondary scale. So very, very similar scale right here. What this is, if you were to actually implement, this is simply just an Excel document. And so you'd have to create a system where 3 times a year, some schools only do twice, but 3 times a year, maybe the English teacher or a homeroom teacher will fill this out for each student. And you can see that they will rate this certain aspects and features of each student. And the intention of this is to go ahead and figure out which students need support. It unfortunately can be used sometimes for inappropriate reasons, such as assessing if a teacher is being effective in their classroom management. Very inappropriate reason to use this. What you are doing is you're figuring out at the beginning of the school year, you do this 6 weeks after the school year starts the first time. You are figuring out which students need support, generally where you are school-wide. So you can both look at students individually, identify their score, and you can look at school-wide, you can look at more aggregated data to see where are we at as far as students in the Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3 range, which this does for you. So this is one of the ways that we, at the school that I was working at, could identify well ahead of time students need support and who needs that support. And rather than wait till issues escalate, how can we go ahead and provide that support for them? Additionally, with our TI²B team meetings, we also had other forms of data. You don't want to just limit yourself to one type of data to make very important decisions. And I think any time that you're requesting that a child enroll in an intervention, you need to have multiple forms of data and grasp that this can be a life-changing decision for the student to give them support. And so you're going to look at how trajectories can very much affect students in just a bit. But some of the other pieces that we would utilize is office discipline referrals. And you can see right here, proficient score, at risk, and high risk, once again, at the tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 range to know who do we need to support. You can see the SRSS data right there. We would look at absences, tardies, in-school suspension, out-of-school suspension, and then we use Class Dojo as well as that classroom management piece for teachers. In our meetings, you can get the times to review. We would do this about monthly for the most part. We go ahead and look at the data to figure out which students needed support. And sometimes, regardless of data, we would ask teachers, hey, sometimes students need support, and we might miss out on who that is. And so we created a nomination form, and I took this from TSS Center's website. The website name changed to Grant, but it used to be Tennessee spelled out, Tennessee BSP, B as in boy, bsp.org. If you type that in, it'll basically like autocorrect. It still serves as a proxy for the new website. And so I had a referral or a nomination form for staff members to fill out for students who needed support. Now, this included not just for behavioral interventions, also for myself as well. If we considered it's needing more than simply just a check-in that day, but need most likely ongoing support, we had a way for teachers and members, paraprofessionals as well, to nominate. And I didn't put it on here, but had a way for parents and guardians to nominate their children as well. So I wanted to point out, and this is where if you don't like data very much, I'm one of those who absolutely loves it. If it's used properly and within context, it can be amazing. And so it came out from PBIS apps. They operate in Oregon, and they've done an extensive amount of research regarding behavior. And so I came upon this article at one point a few years ago, and we immediately began to implement it starting that school year. And it's called the October Catch. And so you can see the graph down here at the bottom, and it refers to, I don't know if you can see the mouse, but you can see right here at this line, students who had, really going to look right here at October. And so students who basically didn't have an office discipline referral by October, most likely were never going for one. Students who had 2 to 5 October, you can see they increased. Okay. So about 1. And then you can see students right here in this last range. If students had more than 2 or more ODRs by October, you can see the trajectory that they often follow. So if we know this about students, we can intervene very quickly. I can look back at this data and I can say, if a student did not have an ODR by October, typically speaking, they're in that tier 1 range, solid classroom management, a safe culture, that's going to be adequate for them to succeed. Students who had maybe just 1 by October, they might end up in 1 or 2 more by the end of the school year. Maybe tier 2 supports is needed, but for the most part, good class management, tier 1 support is still pretty adequate. However, those students who ended up having 2 or more by October, you can see that lets you know well ahead of time, hey, that trajectory is just going to escalate. And so once again, what can we do to support them and intervene early? And that's when you want to look all of your options as far as what are your interventions going to enroll them in. Okay, so then you get into what's called resource mapping. Okay, so resource mapping has to do with, this one is for the district. And so the district ideally has some funded programs and agreements with outside agencies, particularly like Centerstone, STARS, anything like that can get brought into the school to help students out. I did a screenshot of an example. This was not particularly ours, but you can district-wide, these were the options that you had. Okay. So skill streaming, that would be more of a tier 1 support. You can go into 2 with small group counseling. Alveus is more of that tier 1, kind of building that safe culture. Check in, check out, in that tier 2 range, although it can be built out into tier 3. Breaks are better. Simply a modification of check in, check, which serves tier 2 or tier 3. Centerstone, which once again, we always just considered, even though they might be using the same modality as the student, we considered, if we brought in Centerstone, we considered that student to be enrolled in a tier 3 intervention. And so asking yourself, what are the supports, the external agencies that I can utilize in my school? And then Strong Brain Program, that's Tennessee's funded program to not just teachers and educators about ACEs, but really stakeholders statewide, dentists, lawyers, parents as well, really trying to build out a culture to fully understand about trauma, how it much affects a person, not just a child, but a person throughout their entire lives. It's not destiny, but it does make a difference oftentimes. And the more that we can understand that, the more we can go ahead and implement things within a school system to make sure that equitable services are met. So in the particularly of counseling, the school that I was at, we had kind of like 4 options. If we basically do a referral or using that early identification, we would have meetings, and I didn't put that slide in here about what our meetings look like. But if you've been trained in RTS squared B or MTSSB, you know what those look like. Typically about 2 or 3 times a month, you're meeting as a team. You either look at data and or you look at nomination forms, and you are figuring out when a student qualifies based on data, multiple forms of data, not just one, but multiple forms of data, and based on the context of the presenting problem, what intervention is most adequate for the child. So the first option would have been me as a school counselor. That for me was much more in the brief context, brief counseling. Didn't have such a schedule where I could commit to seeing the child once a week, every week, but I very much would commit to 3 to 5 sessions, sometimes up to 8 in total. But if we thought that the child would need ongoing, long-term counseling, then we wanted to look beyond. And I will admit, I can remember when I was going through my graduate program, how I was so overly confident, and I was just like, why would anyone utilize any kind of external agency whenever I am trained to be a counselor? And so I remember going into the school system and getting humbled very quickly at the amount of need that was there, and being like, I get it now. I need help. I cannot do this all by myself. But I very much had kind of that superhero mindset, but got humbled very, very quickly early on. So I very quickly, like, sending nominations, forming this relationship with Centerstone to make sure that as many students could have counseling that they needed. So our next step with that was we had a school-based therapist from Centerstone in our school, and thankfully she was there 3 days a week. And then last year, it was more legislation that was passed where we were able to have a school-based behavioral health liaison. She was employed in Centerstone as well. And what she was able to do is basically take a step further than our school-based therapist. And she not only could do individual counseling, but part of how she was funded was to also provide counseling for the family. And so I was ecstatic that we would have funding like that. And she was basically the other 2 days of the week. And so my last school year in the school system, we had someone from Centerstone all 5 days. So it was me as a school counselor plus a Centerstone counselor, or I think I said Centerstone for myself, but me as a school counselor. And then I also had a Centerstone counselor there with me as well. So it was very another counselor in the school system. And then this one had to do those outside referrals. And from my understanding, the legislation passed on this where we're not held liable by any means by suggesting a referral. As long as we're giving out options, we can just say, hey, based on what we're experiencing from the student, it does warrant considering an outside referral for either individual or family counseling. So when we would meet, these were our options, just simply in the context of counseling. I'm not going to go over check in, check out, breaks are better, or anything like that. So tying it back into, and I'm going to just look at the time just quickly, going back into our professional standards and competencies as school counselors, really we have two, and there are more than this, but I've just picked out two. But the first one has to do with applying developmental, learning, counseling, and educational theories with our practices. So obviously focusing just on counseling theories is that we can use established and emerging evidence-based counseling theories and techniques that are effective in a school setting to promote academic, career, and social emotional development. The second one is providing short-term counseling small group and individual settings. And the one that I want to focus on for this is explaining the impact of adverse childhood experiences and trauma and demonstrate techniques to support students who have experienced trauma. So right here we have in our, and this simply comes from the ASCA website, but here we have that it is within our standards and our competencies to make sure that we are utilizing not simply just established, but also emerging evidence-based practices. And that changes things because that changes the comfortability of some. And as always, you would only operate in the modality that you're trained and feel competent in. But it is okay. I feel like somewhere along the way, it became understood that we could only use solution focused or only use CBT. And I would say that if we're looking at this right here, it is okay as long as it's evidence-based that we can use these emerging techniques, because particularly within the counseling field, the brain-based research that's happening is making a significant difference in the field. And beyond that, it's a lot of what some people refer to as somatic work or body work is being implemented in a school counseling setting as well. And so we'll talk just briefly about that today. So as it said in that second competency and standard, not only just having an understanding for yourself, but for others as well. So let's talk about trauma in the brain for just a bit. And this comes from Emdr, which is basically the institute that trains people in EMDR. And I will admit, EMDR brain spotting would most likely go outside of the scope of practice of a school counselor. Not saying that one could not get trained and be competent, but it does kind of become questionable whether that's within the scope of practice within a school counselor in the school setting. But regardless, having the information, the knowledge to be able to implement and understand what's happening is very important. So we want to start with the amygdala. And this makes a vast difference in children's lives, people's lives, but children in particular, regarding behavior, regarding feeling safe. And so when children have experienced trauma, and let's be more biological about this, simply they have toxic stress. Cortisol levels are continually high. And so when a child has had cortisol levels continually escalated throughout their life, there is an effect on the brain that is ongoing. Thankfully, neuroplasticity, neurogenesis does demonstrate to us that changes can be made, but we do need to recognize that an effect has happened on the brain whenever a child continually experienced toxic stress. And when I say that, once again, just perpetually increased cortisol levels. So the amygdala actually increases. That can be called the alarm signal or the fear center of the brain. The amygdala acts as an alarm signal for stressful events, helps us protect us from danger. I mean, that's its job, is to make sure that we stay safe, out of harm's way, to keep us living. And so it serves a very important role in our lives. Trauma can cause the amygdala to stay overactive, though. This can lead to feelings of anxiety or simply feeling like you're in danger, even sitting in a desk in a classroom, feeling like your life is being threatened, that you're unsafe. The second part of this regarding the effects of trauma is that the hippocampus shrinks. The hippocampus assists with learning and memory, which, if we're thinking about a child sitting in a classroom, that's incredibly important. And to know that piece of our brain is shrinking due to trauma helps us to grasp why there might be some cognitive deficits with some children. And I don't want to kind of overgeneralize here. It doesn't mean that it applies to every child, but know that it is possible with how. It can help calm the amygdala, but it can cause it to shrink. Trauma can. And cues to calm the amygdala are weakened, which cause flashbacks or confusion around the trauma memory. I don't know if it took me kind of back into the school scene. And what I mean by that is I was a school counselor for 5 years total, but in my 4th year, I returned to MTSU to pursue more of a clinical background when it came to counseling. And then I began to hear new terms that I didn't when I went through school counseling program. Same program, but the trauma and piece began to really ramp up at MTSU. And so I began to hear terms such as triggered. And I remember thinking, and sometimes you're like, I knew that already, but I was lacking in this information. But I remember hearing triggered for the first time and having to read quite a bit of literature to grasp what that was referring to. And so many of you probably know, but let's just go through it in a way that triggering refers to, even in the present moment, when you are technically, quote unquote, safe, something in the environment, some kind of stimuli that's being perceiving. And it refers back to things in your past that are unresolved. And so the person in front of me whom I'm experiencing might have the sound or the tone of the person in my past in which abuse occurred. So I might have this quite disproportionate response to the, just with a slight increase of the person's voice being raised, I might go back into that time in my life that's unresolved of when I was actually getting hurt, or my life maybe was in danger, or perceived it was going to be in danger due to how scary that person was coming across. And then to the front part of the brain, last part of our brains, unfortunately, to develop, regardless of who you are, that 18-22 range is really when the prefrontal cortex matures and manages thoughts, behavior, and helps us control emotional response to events. Normally, this area helps decide that a situation is okay. Unfortunately, trauma weakens the signals from this area, allowing negative emotions from the memory to take over the prefrontal cortex's reasoning. And so you've probably seen Dan Siegel's hand model. We won't go over it. This is referring to kind of like their lid is flipped. And so rather than being able to experience something, carries that kind of flavor, that tone of feeling unsafe, being able to kind of rationalize yourself into, oh, that was just a chill. It doesn't mean someone's coming up to hit me. That prefrontal cortex's ability to do that. Unfortunately, there's an effect on that. It's more difficult for someone who's toxic stress throughout their lives to be able to use that reality. Yeah. So let's go over Paul theory in the sense, and when I learned this theory, it really began to help me to physiological, what's happening in a person's body. in the context of sometimes we might think, oh, it's all about just reframing and it's about a new perspective, kind of that CBT perspective. But if we go back to this theory, we know that there are some tendencies of the body, one, to keep us alive, to keep us safe. And so if you've ever seen National Geographic, you see this play out quite a bit more. And yet there's a direct parallel with us as human beings and how we respond to certain situations. So let's start in the middle. And what this is called is the window of tolerance. And so you want to just kind of assess yourself right now and notice how you're feeling. Do you feel kind of calm? If you wear a Garmin or an Apple Watch, kind of looking, are you kind of in that resting heart rate? Yeah. If so, and if you feel safe, we kind of say that you're in that window of tolerance. And we'll come back to this in just a bit. Typically speaking, you feel in this state love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness. You're able to focus, you're able to sit in a classroom and learn, be able to reason, problem solve. You're able to be curious and compassionate. That's what you're able to do. And really what we're referring to here is your ability to connect to somebody else. Can I form a friendship right now? And you actually have to be in a certain physiological state to be able to connect intimately with somebody else. And I say intimate, definitely not in the romantic sense, but simply in the context of being vulnerable with somebody and forming a relationship, even platonically. However, there are kind of two directions you can go dysregulation. The top one is what we refer to as hyperarousal. The second one below it is hypoarousal. This can somewhat refer to the heart rate, not necessarily although, but if you're familiar with Gottman, who are pioneers in the relationship field, they refer to hyperarousal or flight as flooding. And so what they refer to in their training is if you are getting in 100 beats per minute or beyond, you're probably in that fight or flight response. And so while we don't typically have these animalistic responses, what we typically do have in the fight response is we might raise our voice, get quite defensive, we pace, be quite hypervigilant, looking around. If the door opens in the classroom, we have to look every single time. You might have a kid run away, and if you work in the school system, you've probably been experiencing children eloping from the classroom. If that's the case, they're in fight or flight response, simply just feeling uncomfortable. The main thing to remember here is that the students are not learning if they're in the fight or flight response, and they're not able to form strong connects for the most part with people. If below that, all the way down to the bottom, we also have hypoarousal. And the difference between hyper and hypoarousal, for the most part, is there's this brain's perception of I'm in danger. Okay, I'm in danger, probably me get away or I can defend myself. If I believe I'm simply just in danger, I'm probably fight or flight. If I believe my life is over, this ends, I'm in hypoarousal. And this is where we see, especially children who've experienced really unfortunate and traumatic events, you see dissociation. And dissociation is a spectrum. I mean, the most mild form of dissociation is just daydreaming, no harm to that. But you can go all the way to this other end of the spectrum, and you're getting people who basically look like they're completely out of body. And so you might be able to have a different perspective if you had to have it basically like we use the term shutdown. They're not responding, they have a blank look on their face. And if that's the case, there is this perception on their part over, and you might say to yourself, I would never hurt a kid, why are they responding that way? But remember, we're not talking about the rational prefrontal cortex point, we're talking about the amygdala, this midbrain section as well, which is saying, hey, you're in extreme amount of danger over, there's no sense in even trying. Okay. And you can get way more technical with all this. We won't go into the full physiological pieces of polyvagal theory, But what I will say is how I used a school counselor was I trained our staff members at my school polyvagal theory. I wanted them to understand the difference amongst fight or flight, the window of tolerance, and a hypoarousal state. I wanted them to know, and I'm always learning myself, but if I would learn it, I thankfully was at a place with my administration where I was able to share staff members. And I think just the heart of our staff members, obviously they got quite tired sometimes, but the heart is always there to learn and to build a safe culture for our students. And so it became as in always to understand when I was experiencing a certain behavior from a student, an increased voice volume, talking to Simker, wanting to get up, bucking up a chest or something like that, what that's about. And to have tools, which we'll get to be able to help with that regulation. And once again, Julia, actually, we're going to get to that as well and be much more detailed in their approach. But it is important to understand what's happening physiologically for a student from time to time. You could look up a lot more YouTube videos, read Dr. Stephen Porges' book about this, and then Deb Dana took work as a researcher and a scientist. She's a clinician, and so she did it much more from a clinician approach on how to utilize this within a counseling setting. But I will say, if you have students who have tendencies to yell, to cuss people out, to run out of the classroom, to really get your hands on more information about polyvagal theory to help you to understand this is not so much about trying to use rationality with them, but there might be other techniques such as soothing and you modifying the tone of your voice and helping them to ask, they simply just don't feel safe right now. How can you help them to feel safe? And if you go back to tier 1, you can begin to teach that to them as well, not just simply doing it for them so they experience co-regulation, but they can get to a point of experience self-regulation as well. Okay. So also in the work that I began to, and in my last year as a school counselor, I really began to utilize more somatic work in my counseling. And seen by somatic is really just incorporating the body into any kind of approach. I believe that for myself personally, my counseling is probably more on the shallow side, much more from a CBT perspective, which I'm not calling shallow in general. I mean, the way I would use it was often kind of shallow in nature. We just had kids try to just, let's just do a little reframe here. And so when I went back, I remember I began to not so heavily focus on using rationality to help children to feel safer and use a different approach and to respond, but really incorporating the work of the body into the process. And so one of the main ways was recognizing that body actually communicates to the mind. If you think about it, you don't typically feel your emotions like in your brain, you feel your emotion in your body. And so if you're very out of touch with your body, and regardless of whether you would say you have any kind of addiction or whatnot, I think we all have tendencies which can get us to our body. If you find yourself being very, very continually, it's hard to connect to the body. Work a lot. If you engage in quite a bit of compulsive behaviors, scrolling endlessly, binge watching things, all those, while there might be benefit to them, really disconnect us from our body and really prevent our body from healing the way that it's intended to do. We must be able to place consciousness with our body to be able to heal through whatever, not simply just some big T traumatic event, but just simply just adverse experiences throughout the day. And so in my work now, typically work with adults, typically in addictions, but those focus where there's been quite a bit of trauma, is I really get them connected to their body. And I would do this with children too in my last year as a school counselor, but really having them to connect. And one of the things that I would teach them is that how if I have a relate to somebody else, then for the most part, yes, there are nonverbals and events that we can go through, typically the language that we're using to form that relationship is words. Okay? But the body doesn't have the ability to communicate with words what it's feeling. And I'm almost going to kind of personify the body for just a bit. And so what I would do a lot of times is lead these mindfulness meditations and really just a body scan. And I would say, let's not worry about labeling our emotion quite yet. Let's just focus on sensations. You might feel heaviness. You might feel butterflies. You might feel emptiness. You might feel fullness. Okay? So sensations like that throughout the body, tingling, pressure, really getting people in touch with just sensations. Because if we break down the word emotions, just energy, emotion, energy and emotion, it's just sensations. And typically there's both a temperature and a movement that we feel within our body to kind of connect to it to understand quite a bit more. So I would take people crown of their head all the way down to their toes, helping them to connect to those certain sensations and to be able to recognize that's your body trying to communicate to you about how it's feeling. And the minute that you can go into a room and just take a minute, maybe even briefer than that, and just to assess what sensations am I feeling in my body, that helps me to connect, helps me to heal, helps me to understand myself quite a bit more. And so let me refer to this chart that I've had up here for a while and have yet to explain. This is not a body scan, it's not some fancy MRI machine. This is just simply a support of well over 700 people, actually not in the US, but in Europe. And they were asked to, with certain emotions, and yes, I'm going from sensations and leading into emotions at this point, but they were asked, when you feel this emotion, where in your body do you feel it? And then you see the color code that white and a very light blue would indicate a lack of feeling. And then you go to yellow being an intense amount of feeling. So you can see in this chart not only kind of a composite of all these self-reports, not just where in the body for these emotions, but what's the intensity level. And if you go down to the bottom row to depression, you can see how different depression looks than most others, but especially anger. You can see that there's or depressive symptoms, a lack of feeling. And so when you have children, I don't know if you've experienced this before, but you might ask a child, how are you feeling? To have a child say, I feel nothing. And if they say they feel just that, there might be an extreme lack on. But I did consider it an important work in the counseling setting to have them connect to their body, able to notice not simply what are you feeling, but where in your body do you feel that. And when you can do that, it leads into you much safer, which leads us into this. So Lieberman and others conducted a study in 2007 in which he was trying to assess what is the quickest ways to help someone to feel safer when they do feel scared. And so what he found when engaging in kind of different responses is when a person could label their own emotion, label you see right on the first bar on the left on the chart, when they could name the emotion they were experiencing, the amygdala immediately basically quieted down. And remember, if we go back, that amygdala is the fear center. It tells you, hey, this is unsafe right now in my environment. People who could acknowledge, hey, I feel very scared right now, those people, their amygdala quiet down. And so I can remember not only in grasping, I'm doing a whole lot of admission of my humility over the years, but I can remember not grasping how important it is simply to just focus on emotion identification with children. And yet I can look at a scan like this, and this actually is an fMRI as well. So this actually is a brain scan, but you can see when you simply just teach, and I say just, but it's quite profound, even teaching children to be able to connect to the body and to be able to label how they're feeling immediately creates a safer environment. And when I say environment, remember, it's not just the room that I'm in, but my body is an environment as well. And so maybe the room, quote unquote, is safe, but inside my body is not safe. And so actually one of the lines in my mission statement as a school counselor was actually to help establish an environment, both internally and externally, that was safe for students. And so I wanted to help students to feel safe in their own body. And children who've experienced quite a bit of toxic stress often do not feel safe in their own bodies, even if everyone else in the room would never harm them. So even this practice right here, using your classroom lessons, school-wide lessons, to focus on affect labeling can have a profound effect on a child feeling safe in their own body. I also want to talk about this research as well. I'm being very research heavy at this point, and then we'll get into some specific interventions. But Dumas is I believe he's French scientist, but in 2011, he conducted another brain scan. But what he did, he was able to actually scan two people at the same time. And so what happened here is he had the one on the right who started modeling hand movement, no words, all nonverbals, but started moving his hand, and he would have the partner move their hand as well and try to match the hand movement. Once again, this is all about nonverbals. And what they found is you can see a slight distinction between what lit up in their brains. But if you look at and go back and read the study, their brain waves began to match each other's. One person copying the other. Just the hand movement, getting in attunement or matching that of the other person. So Alan Shore has taken Dumas's work and he's proposed this hypothesis, and this is basically his life's work, is the attunement that a child needs from, and this is a bit stereotypical with the mother because obviously fathers and others can play a significant role, but most of the research, is about from child to mother. But in the same way, the effect that a mother who's highly attuned to the child, when the child cries, the mother has this kind of concerned look on her face, and when the child laughs, the mother also has this smile to her face. And it's this kind of what we call serve and return, this back and forth of the baby sees, hey, when I feel this way, there's a response from someone, not someone who's either kind of got that flat affect happening or is tirelessly busy, but the baby can detect very, very quickly that there is this return from the parent. So Alan Shore has proposed, what if the same context that a mother, the beneficial effect that attunement from a mother has on a child, can therapists have the same effect on a client? And so this is his life's work, and I think he's biased because this is his work, but what is very cool is that they are finding that that is the case. A therapist, a clinician, a school counselor, who in the moment when you have a student in front of you who's highly attuned, facial expression, body language, when you're with that student in front of you and they see that you're responding to their hurt, to their pain, to their excitement, you begin to see brainwaves beginning to match each other, and you are actually creating safety within themselves. And I know this might sound a little bit frou-frou, but they carry these experiences with them throughout their lives. And they experience in that moment what's called co-regulation and proper co-regulation leads into self-regulation. They've had these experiences in the past where they were in distress, and the adult with them was able to share their calm and teach them two very, very important things here. One, that what they were feeling was valid. Very, very important. What they were feeling was valid. And the other thing that's important is what they are feeling is temporary. And when a child has that experience of what I'm feeling is both valid and temporary, I won't spend my life with the understanding, with this notion that my pain will never end. So just being with a student as a school counselor, non-verbally, just being with them in that moment, helping them, as Alan Shore says, to feel felt, has this effect that they will carry through the rest of their lives. And I just wanted to start with that because when we get into certain interventions, no matter what the intervention is, the modalities you're using, just know that right hemisphere, that emotional aspect of our brain, left is more rational, but right is more emotional. When we are accessing that part of our mind, it's far less about the actual intervention that's being used and so much more about non-verbally, what are they experiencing from you? Do I feel felt? Okay? Do I feel felt? So in my learning, going and doing much more clinical work, I've learned that there are modalities that are able to target the brain differently. And so this is what I was referring to, and there is an emergence of new modalities and interventions. And I say new, not really new, but new, I think, as far as implementation within our field. And so there are two basically approaches that we can utilize in the counseling setting. And the first, I'm going to start on the right side, is a top-down approach. This is where, when I say top-down, it's typically talk therapy. And so we're going through the prefrontal cortex and trying to access much more into that midbrain section of a child to help address toxic stress, trauma reprocessing. And what I can say with that is that while it's effective, it does take longer to make a difference in a child's life. So CBT, which is commonly used, Adlerian, solution focused, those are called top-down approaches. They help clients to think differently about the situation. The second one that you see up top to the right that's that mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. It kind of has this approach of getting to that midbrain a bit quicker, but it still has that kind of more cognitive approach in it. Once again, please don't misunderstand. It is very effective. It's just in the sense that it can take a bit longer, and all of these approaches need to be utilized in tandem with each other to really benefit a student. If we go over to the left side, we can see what's called bottom-up approaches. And these help clients to cope with their raw emotions and defense reactions. EMDR, I'm a bit offended that brain spotting is not on there because that's what I utilize for the most part. Yoga, comprehensive resource modeling, which is basically EMDR and brain spotting, but in a much more gentle way. And then we have sensory motor psychotherapy. And these are what we call bottom-up approaches. They're able to access that midbrain much quicker to get to those traumatic experiences. So these can be modified in such a way, other than EMDR, but these can be modified in such a way where it is appropriate for a school counselor to utilize. Sensory motor, very easy way to incorporate this, is simply much incorporation of the body. So if you have a student thinking back to polyvagal theory, and they're in that hypoarousal, that what we call the dorsal vagal, and they've kind of shut down, you want to just help them to just kind of move their body just a bit because they're lacking feeling. They can't connect to their own body. So having them just kind of move their hands, move their fingers. One of the things that I do, especially with trauma reprocessing with clients, and yes, this is outside of the school setting, but you could use this part in the school, is combining the research of Dumas with this is that I have students copy my feet movement. And I just kind of, I don't know if you can see my hands, but I would do this with my feet. I'd say, match my feet. Okay. I would do that, and that helps them to reconnect to their body and to get it moving, especially if a child's response often with trauma or toxic stress is to kind of freeze, collapse, and go like this. Okay. Helping them to move their body to get out of that hypoarousal state. And so I won't go too much more into this, but I just do want to make mention that there are modalities which are heavily brain-based and can be much more effective. And I think once you begin to learn them a bit more, there can be incorporation of these into a school setting. One more mention, comprehensive resource modeling, EMDR. One small component of this is to help them to create a safe place in their mind if they feel very scared. Where's a place that you visited in the past? Maybe read in a book, maybe watched on TV, or maybe you can just entirely make it up. A safe place that you can imagine yourself. And use your senses. Look around this place. Notice what you can smell. Imagine that they might go to the beach or go off in the woods somewhere. Or they might just simply be in their bedroom, which is a safe place. And they're able to pretend that they're in this place just for a bit to get back into feeling safe in their body. Okay. All right. Let's quite quickly go into a few interventions. So with school setting, and I'm heavily biased towards not simply just talk therapy, but in implementing expressive arts into the counseling setting. And so I want to show you this one first. And this is actually a colleague of mine when we were in training together for non-directive child-centered play therapy, which can be utilized in a school setting and by a school counselor. And I'd like to tell you about the context of this because this was only within 6 sessions that this profound work began to emerge, which falls in that scope of practice for a school counselor. And so regardless of what you hear about, oh, you won't get deep with the student until many, many sessions later, I would say that has not been congruent with my experiences. So what you're seeing here is to the right, I purposely, is of course, are out of the picture, but to the right is my colleague, and left was a client that she had. And we had I always forget if it's a 1 or 2-way mirror, but I was on the other side and I took a picture, of course, below the face. But you can see right here, the boy's right hand, he has a white bear, and then the colleague has a black ape. And the boy is African American, or a boy who had been adopted by a white family. What began to emerge very quickly in his counseling sessions through expressive arts was his racial identity concerns. He had this desire to look more like his adoptive family. So what he was able to do in these sessions is begin to really explore. And for one, I think with CBT, some have the tendency to utilize, oh, don't think like that. Oh, well, let's just use a cognitive reframe right here. And what I would request that you do is really begin to just validate for a while. Validate how a child feels, empathize with them. And when you do that, a child's innate ability to heal will really begin to emerge. Okay? So you can see right here that he chose a white animal and he wanted his therapist to represent the black animal. And so what began to happen in these sessions was dual, white versus black. And what I didn't take it because it would have involved his face was he actually one day covered his face with white sand to look more like his parents. And so really this was some profound work part to just help us to grasp really the joy that he was having was simply just looking different than his family. And so thankfully the clinician was there, really able to validate how he was feeling and get him to a place where he understood himself much more and to work through that. Another scene I'd like to show you is this is me as a school counselor in my office. office, and I didn't have to do anything like that. There's always a cheap way to do things, and it works just as fine when you don't have any money as a school counselor. And so I just simply put out some brown paper to represent the sand. I would often use animals instead of people so that the sim could play out much better. But the boy in third grade and seemingly didn't get along with anybody and was verbally reporting that he didn't like anybody, didn't feel safe with anybody, and didn't want to be at school. And so we engaged in some non-directed child play therapy, with the exception of I did give him a slight prompt, which is union and approach, sand play. Asked him to create the scene in his classroom for me. So you can see this this division happening of all these animals over there, all these things. You wouldn't label anything until the child does, but all of these things over here, and then these animals around the water as well. And after the end, I did ask for an interpretation about who and what these things were. And so what we found out through play was that he really did feel loved, he did care about his teacher, and that there were a few students in his classroom whom he did feel safe and connected to. However, when we just engaged in talk therapy, that was not the story. There was a heavy emphasis on who doesn't like me, I don't feel safe. But when he got to play this out, you could see that people he cared about and whom he thought cared about him. And so I would just like to propose that sometimes with talk therapy and expressive arts, you can find out a more comprehensive story about what's going on. And the last intervention that I just want to briefly touch on really is two, but it's the empty chair, and then we'll get to parts work in a bit. But being much more with the bias of using expressive therapy is, I would love to see the empty chair. And what probably comes to mind as a kid, you're probably thinking of Gestalt and talking to someone who's passed away. That is definitely use that. Some people might make that work in a school setting. I would use the other chair to represent whomever the child needed to address. Sometimes a student would come in or talk about how upset they were feeling with their teacher. And rather than talking to me as the counselor about how upset they were with the teacher, whatever the teacher did, I would have them pretend talking to the teacher, and then have them switch. And then you be the teacher and respond to yourself. And so through that, you see this quite different kind of what we call in IFS, the self-merge. And what that's referring to is this part of yourself that is always compassionate, always curious, always wanting connection, no matter what the situation is. And so I don't think we could have gotten there a lot of times had we just simply used talk therapy, which is much more of that left rational thinking, but really getting into right hemisphere as well with that emotional side of being able to tap into parts of yourself. So not only would I have them, let's represent that this is the teacher over here and you talk to the teacher, and then you be the teacher and talk back to yourself. I would have them do this with sibling issues. Hey, that's your brother over there. Tell your brother how you've been feeling. Okay, now you be your brother. And imagine that. So they're able to take this other perspective. And this is really getting in a child operate less from the child ego and operate much more into what we call the adult ego. They're able to take different perspectives, but that only typically happens whenever they're able to kind of personify that other part, which leads us into actual parts work. And so what I would use chairs for sometimes is to represent different parts of themselves. So high school counselors in particular, you have students who experience quite a bit more dilemmas in life. Well, I could do this. I have this option. I also have this option. And instead of doing, while, on a chart, pros and cons can be very helpful, let them actually operate entirely from one part of them, and how much fun that would be, or how inconsistent that would be they want to be. Oh, one part of me wants to go to college right another part of me wants to go off, just travel for a bit, find myself. Great. Let's set up 2 chairs. Let's pretend that you're the part of you that entirely wants to go to college. That person, play it out. Now be that person who's kind of hesitant and is like, I think I'd rather travel, okay? So anytime you have a student facing dilemmas, rather than just hashing it out with me, I would say, let's personify all these different parts of you and these perspectives. Okay? So those are just kind of 3 modalities that I would use, or that I would use in a setting. And due to coming to a close on my time, let's move on to the last part, which is really about coping skills. And so you can see different categories, where the first one has to do with soothing skills. And so soothing or grounding, sometimes there's different terminology, but one of my absolute favorite with grounding skills is to do the 5 senses. And so you would ground and have them access their 5 senses, and I would say just kind of label what are 5 things that you can see in the room. The point of this is to teach them self-regulation, which does not come quite naturally to a person. It very much has to be taught. So have children go around my counseling office, or maybe if we're in the hallway, what are 5 things you can see? They would tell me 4 things you can touch, 3 things you can hear, 2 things you can smell, and 1 thing you can taste. So, going in that range of 5, 4, 3, 2, to helping children to reconnect and to feel safe in their body. Also, there are distraction techniques. If you're quite dysregulated, hypoarousal, reading books, becoming more expressive, utilizing artwork, watching movies, switching over. I know I'm a bit quick at this point, but utilizing opposite action, teaching them that just because you feel like doing something doesn't mean you actually have to operate congruently to that emotion. You feel angry and you want to hit that person, and yet you could do the opposite action of doing something quite kind for that person. Quite a different coping skill there. Emotional awareness, we went over that quite extensively. Simply just help children and students to identify how they're feeling. That in and of itself can calm them down. Mindfulness as well. This was mainly my approach to the Tier 1 level, classroom lessons, helping them to center themselves, ground themselves, whatever terminology is appropriate for your population. Obviously, sometimes it feels spiritual, and that's not very congruent to some people's core. And so just finding the terminology that fits your population, both inclusively, meaning that you're not just taking the dominant culture, being willing to deviate and to look at all the, making sure that they're represented in the classroom. Breathing exercises as well was one of my main go-to teaching children in the school setting. And so different styles of deep breathing. One of my favorite is called breathing. And so you would breathe in through your nose to the count of 4, out of your mouth to the count of 4 as well, with no pauses. Okay, so in, breathing out, breathing in and breathing out, breathing in and breathing out. Really helping connect to their body to kind of calm themselves down if they're in a hyper-arousal state. Okay? And the last one is the crisis plan. This is much more for the secondary level, but still very much applies to primary, but helping them to have a plan of support as well. Sometimes these are called like safety contracts. I'm not talking about the attempts that, hey, sign that you're not going to attempt suicide. I'm referring to, hey, you want to harm yourself or harm others, the plan that we have for support that you have and for resources. So I went through that very quickly. I apologize, but this is very easy to access for yourself, but really focusing on skills. And so very quickly, if we go back to that last piece in the beginning of evaluating how what you're doing is working. And like I admitted, it's quite difficult with counseling interventions in particular But what we would do is just kind of all of our efforts together, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, and you can see office discipline referrals. You can see that our efforts really year after year are paying off. I didn't include the 2021 school year. That was when we returned from the pandemic, and it turns out keeping kids 6 feet apart caused problematic behaviors to be greatly reduced. So that data, in my opinion, is not very valid as far as interventions. It was not my desire to continue to keep kids 6 apart for the rest of their lives. Children need connection, need touch, whenever physically it's safe to do such. But anyway, I just wanted to point that we knew that we were onto something that was making a significant difference. These are office referrals. SRSS data, you can see very quickly. Blue is tier 1, purple is tier 2, red is tier 3, and you can see, especially internalizing, every year we increased in how many students no longer needed tier 2 and tier 3 supports, which was very encouraging for us. Externalizing, not necessarily the case. There was always significant work for us to do with externalizing behaviors. But if I go back to office discipline referrals, we can see we apparently were making a difference with those externalizing behaviors. Okay. All right. Well, I appreciate your time. That was probably a lot of information. And so I just wanted to mainly discuss the framework, any counseling attempts that you incorporate as a school counselor. Please try to incorporate that within a framework to help yourself know that you're making a difference, to be able to assess that, and to have options. To look at, while typically a person might just CBT or solution focused in the school setting is appropriate, per our standards and competencies, it is okay to utilize evidence-based emerging techniques. And then third, just to show you some of those modalities that much more that I learned about in the clinical practice and setting, but can be easily implemented and adapted. So I'm going to hand it back to Dr. Wilson, and thank you.
That was really incredible. Especially as a counselor, I think being able to go outside the box, solution focus, CBT is just really imperative that school counselors may have other modalities that they can use, particularly in the trauma-informed framework, assess framework, and within a comprehensive school counseling model. So that was just wonderful, wonderful information. We do have some questions. I'll be toggling back and forth between a computer. The first one is, how would you go about being more organized in which students can get counseling? So helping students get counseling, how can you be more organized about that? Because school districts, I know in the state, of what they allow. So how do you propose about doing that?
Sure, and it is very easy to, I think I first of all want to acknowledge that there will always be students that you refer to in a kind of a crisis response, which is very appropriate and very warranted. And at the same time, to make sure that you can be a bit more organized is operating within that framework that you're just the Ask a National model, but this framework that your school established to be able to respond to any kind of at-risk behaviors. And so I think it always goes back to you trying to do it by yourself, but having a team that you're a part of, people can support you with that decision making. I think it goes to data, early identification, what are screeners that you have in place. Schools have gotten good about academic screeners, and at the same time, I think behavioral health screeners are very important. It's just always the concern with how used. And I'll admit that sometimes schools and districts just flat out use them inappropriately. So I think if we're going and making sure we're ethical, looking at any time you use a screener assessment tool, recognizing that, and I apologize for my noise, but recognizing that there are norms set in place for those directions.
And speaking of data, because I know that some school counselors either it's a love-hate relationship with data, right? What of the data are you collecting when you're counseling students?
Yeah, so we were a bit data crazy at my school. And the importance of that is that I don't think necessarily data lies. It's important to have context. Never rely solely on just data because, like I said, if I did the ODRs for the 2020-2021 school year, you would have been like, wow, what did you do? You had the most amazing behavioral support. And what I would say is, no, kids 6 feet apart. So context matters with data always. And so not only context for it, but forms of data. So we would collect office referrals, we'd have our SRSS data, tardies, and teachers simply just writing narratives. Narrative or kind of qualitative data is incredibly important.
Definitely quantitative and qualitative data is both needed.
Yes.
Absolutely. Another question is, if parents do know interventions, how can we still support students?
Tier 1. I mean, just flat out. That's the easiest way I can answer that. When I say tier 1, you don't necessarily need parent consent. And I don't say that in the context of you doing something behind there, but at the tier 1 level, you're doing it for every child. And so ideal and typically for the most part wouldn't go against the parent as well, but we're referring to those school-wide approach, school-wide events, and then classroom lessons as well. So these are classroom lessons. This is the school culture that you've established. So that's the main modality. The other part is if you have some guardians saying no to something, then it might not be the intervention they're saying no. They might be saying, no, we don't have a good enough relationship for me to trust you yet. And so back to that relationship piece and help them to understand, provide some psychoeducation as well.
Absolutely. There's so much power in relationship building with students and with their families. Absolutely. Can you discuss more about brain-based interventions?
Sure. And that's, I mean, it's my appeal of working in a clinical setting as well and getting to see the efficiency of brain-based modalities. 3, I think, big ones are EMDR, which stands for movement desensitization and reprocessing. Different forms of utilizing that. I mean, the most typical, stereotypical one is like making their eyes go forward. The other one is kind of like the tapping as well. But Dr. Wilson, as you and I have talking and running, is bilateral stimulation. And so it helps to integrate both the right ear, which is the emotional side, left is more of the rational. And when you can basically, I try to say it funny with clients when I propose it, but I was like, we can get the right brain and the left brain working, we're getting the whole brain work at the same time to be able to process and validate both the emotional side of us and the rational side of us. So there's that. Brain spotting, I won't get too much into, but comprehensive resource modeling, I think could easily be adapted. The main part of this is helping people to feel safe in their body and utilize what's called inner resources. So really being able to, when you feel scared, upset, nervous, in your mind, who are those safe people in your life, in your past, that when you were around them, there was quite a bit of warmth or safety that you felt. And just in the same way that you can get your mind fixated on something angry about, you can actually do the same thing as far as feeling warmth and connection. And so teaching children how, when you're feeling any emotion that goes outside of the window of tolerance, to imagine that that person is either with you, imagine yourself being with them, and notice, going back to that somatic practice, noticing in your body how you feel when you kind of have them in mind. Some people will never be safe, and I will say, I think it's a bit of a shame, some kind of shying away from incorporation of spirituality in school setting. I mean, thankfully, the counseling field is allowing that and encouraging much more. It's trickier, due to ethics as well. Counselors are allowed to incorporate spirituality. So knowing child's higher power, spirituality, and faith, if they want it in the counseling process, please allow them, rather than having the concern you're going to be sued. If it's their choice to say, for Allah is very comforting to me, that you allow that to be part of the conversation.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. That is so important because we have children from all over the world that we work with, and being able to connect with their higher power is very beneficial in the counseling process. do you have any recommendations for children who have been traumatized but also have sensory deficit, such as autism?
Well, I think with sensory deprivation, I mean, BA, hopefully someone is connected to that in the school setting, a school psychologist with the testing. But what I would really focus on, which I think is appropriate for counselors when working with someone who's autistic, an autistic person. And as I've learned, sometimes we learn person first language, but I've learned with autistic folks, it's kind of like identity first language. And so some people want to be called an autistic person. So just kind of learning the culture as well. So when working with an autistic person, I think it really goes back to that connection with the body. And I'm probably overgeneralizing here, but typically there's an with emotional regulation. And that a lot of times has to do with a lack of connection to the body. And so the more work we can do with mindfulness, meditation, and more of that affect labeling, which once again we know can calm the amygdala down, is kind of the route that I would go with that. I think it's also appropriate within, depending upon the culture you have in school, to have sensory corners or calming desk or sensory tools to utilize, sorry, you can't see my hand, to utilize support and kind of rub to feel connection to your body as well. Anything that to the body, I think, is quite beneficial.
Excellent. Another question along the same line is, do you have any recommendations for working with children who have experienced trauma but may not be fluent in English, or even come from a culture that doesn't have a word for trauma, or for even counseling for that?
Absolutely. Well, that would be the school that I worked at. Quite a few were not from the country, and trauma maybe necessarily from the enter or just from certain circumstances in life. And so I refer back to the work that I present from Dumas and from Alan Shore. We don't have to work that much on word content. It's really not about that if we're talking a child to heal. And it might be a bit offensive, but I think the older person gets, we tend to have this thinking that we need to be right with all their problems. And that is not often the case with this part of it. And so this is the part that might be offensive, but imagine the client in front of you is like a baby sometimes. And it's like, if the baby were crying, upset, how would I soothe them? And it's so much more about my expression, my nonverbals, my attunement with them. And so I might have a kid in front of me, no way that we're able to communicate. And any attempt I do try to communicate is working out. I can just be with them. They can see it almost. I am with them through this pain, through this extent, maybe. I'm just with them. And that feeling of feeling felt that Dumas proposes and Alan Shore proposes, I think is important. So it's not so much about intervention as I throw out the intervention sometimes. Just be with them. Feel their pain with them. That's what empathy really is in the first place.
Absolutely. The power of attunement is so incredible to see and experience, able to experience that with another person, and the healing that can really bring. Absolutely. The last question is, can you talk more about how to set up ways to train teachers on how to support students who've experienced trauma?
Very much about, for one, it always do you have the backing of your administrator? I cannot overemphasize that. When you have the backing of your administrator and your administrator knows the importance, then I very much believe in that top-down approach as far as culture goes. If it's important to your district, it's going to be important to your administrator. If it's important to your administrator, it's going to be important to your teachers. If it's important to your teachers, it's important to your students. I believe that is the quickest way to promote change in culture for anybody. So I would say I was a bit direct with my administrator, but we had a relationship. I would just shove books her way. I would just get in her time about trauma and its effects. So it was a continual conversation. And when I would do that, then it would lead into, hey, William, presentation on trauma. And that came from that influence backing from my administrator.
Educating them about different counseling techniques and interventions and how these can really be built. to their kid.
Absolutely. Yes. I'll very quickly add in, and I think anytime that you're working with a child, the more that you can get that guardian into the context of counseling as well, the more effective. At all times, try to incorporate the family system in general. That's grandma, grandfather, cousins, anybody like that, or just a safe community. The more you can incorporate the context system that the child goes back home to, the more effective you're in your overall approach.
Excellent. Oh, William, thank you so much. This information was so incredible. And I hope that counselors really walk away with a broader understanding that we can work outside of CBT and solution focus, and that there's so much information out there that we use to help kids who've experienced trauma. So thank you for that.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.